The reason why I'm here is that there was a press release from a poster we had at the American Geophysical Union meeting, and I'm a marine geophysicist, and every December there's a meeting in San Francisco, and I think this year it had about 20,000 attendants. It's all the geologists, so certainly all the geophysicists, and a lot of people you wouldn't think of as geophysicists, people studying the atmosphere, and a lot of oceanographers as well go to this meeting. And there was one session on non-seismological uses of seismology. So we put in a poster on the work that I'm going to describe today. And I thought it was buried because it was in this huge poster hall. And I actually went home back to the UW because I had a class to teach, and I left my grad students there. And they just got an incredible reception. And they're probably better at speaking about this work than me. But unfortunately, they're at a retreat on the San Juans for graduate students this weekend, so they can't be here. But that led to this press release. And I normally speak in conferences to rooms that are about this big, but there's usually only about 10 or 20 people sitting there. I found the work that I do on earthquakes fascinating, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that by way of the story, but this clearly does, the work we do with whales captures people's more. And I've just got various acknowledgements I always give them at the start. My two students are Dak Sewell and Michelle Werther-Mueller working on this. Kate Stafford is the Applied Physics Lab at UW and actually knows a huge amount about whale acoustics. I'm really just a beginner. She's been helping both of my students enormously. Rick Thompson is at the Institute of Ocean Sciences, and he's had some data on zooplankton that may be linked to the whales. My colleagues John Delaney and Deb Kelly have been very good at raising funding, which is paid for the installation of the instruments. And then I have colleagues at the University of Oregon, Emily Hoft and Douglas Toomey, Paul McGill at Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and Deborah Stakes at Cuesta College in San Luis Obispo, who participated in the seismic experiments. So it's been a big sort of team effort. I'm a little bit nervous because I don't know a huge amount about whales. And this is probably a summary of everything I know about fin whales. They're the second longest and actually the second heaviest mammal on Earth. They reach lengths of about 27 meters. They're very sleek animals. They're very fast swimmers. They're known as the greyhounds of the ocean. And they can, when they've got a calf, their calves can probably outrun killer whales. They're baleen whales. And unlike blue whales, they can eat a fairly wide variety. Mostly they eat krill, but they can also eat small schooling fish and squid. They range throughout the world's ocean, and they are an endangered species. There are a few tens of thousands of them across the oceans. They've recovered from whaling more quickly probably than blue whales, and nobody really knows why that is. And there's some evidence that the populations are recovering. When you're an animal that is this big, it's energetically worth your while swimming right across the ocean if you can get a good meal on the other side. So they really do swim large distances. And some of the questions we have about whales are, how are their stocks changing over time? There's obviously a lot of interest in how they're recovering from whaling. You want to know what the different populations are around the world, because whales might be doing well in one area but not so well in another, and you need to know what those groups are interbreeding. There's still some concerns about anthropogenic activity, ship noise. Ships make noise at the frequencies that fin whales speak at. And I'm a seismologist, and when I put on another hat, a lot of seismologists go out and make noises with air guns in the oceans, and so that's another source of anthropogenic noise. And really just, where are they in the ocean and why are they there? We know they have to feed and breathe, but they're very hard to study. There's not a great deal known about them. Some of the observational tools you can use to find out where they are and where they're going. Visual surveys. You can tag. We had a talk on tagging, so there's some tagging surveys. And things changing my slides. And you can also use acoustic monitoring, and I'll talk about that. My talk has 4 parts, and I don't know whether I'll get through them all, but I'm going to start about talking about what I do, I'm then going to talk about the installation of our seismic network off the coast. I'll talk about fin rail tracking, and if I've got time, I'll talk about some ongoing work and where we might go in the future. But this is a map of the world's topography and bathymetry. And, you know, if we think about the oceans, I can't talk about plate tectonics in great detail, but the most prominent feature on the Earth is this sort of band of green that you can see going around the oceans. You can basically track it. It's the most prominent feature on the planet. And those are mid-ocean ridges. And those are basically linear volcanoes where two tectonic plates are pulling apart. And that's resurfacing our planet. About 2/3 of our planet gets resurfaced on a geological timescale of about 100 million years. And it makes Earth different from all other planets and planetary bodies in the solar system. And so I've spent, through a program, NSF's Ridge program, studying mid-ocean ridges for about the last 20 years. And most of my work has been in the Pacific Ocean, but when I came to the graduate school, I was in the Woods Hole MIT joint program. My very first experiment was out on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and we'll zoom in on this map, to something called the Kane Transform Fault, which is at about latitude, I think, 23 degrees north, so it's a pretty nice location to be in terms of weather. We went there in December. We left Woods Hole Oceanographic, which is not a good place to be on a ship, in December. We headed south, and a transform fault is something like the San Andreas, where you have two plates sliding by each other, and they produce a lot of earthquakes. So it's basically an offset in the mid-ocean ridge where plates are pulling apart. And the aim was to do a study here of earthquakes. And this is an ocean bottom seismometer or hydrophone instrument. And this is actually a modern one, but physically they haven't changed a lot. Inside these these yellow hard hats are glass spheres which provide flotation. Glass is very strong under compression, so they can withstand the pressures at the bottom of the ocean. There's some pressure cases here which will house various electronics and batteries. There will be a hydrophone maybe on the top or a seismometer on the bottom. And then there's some kind of anchor that you can release acoustically. You basically drop this off a ship, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, records data, and then you come back with the ship and you send an acoustic signal and it releases, and you collect seismic data. And the only thing that's changed over the past 25 years is that nowadays, because of huge advances in sort of electronics, we can put these instruments down and record digital data for a year or more if we really wanted to. At this time, the maximum amount of time these instruments could stay down would be for about 8 days. So we deployed these instruments in a network on the transform fault to record earthquakes. And then, when I got back to the lab, I was a new graduate student, so it was my job to analyze this data. At the time, these were analog instruments, so I would have to play back the tapes of the earthquakes. And earthquakes have frequencies of a few tens of hertz, so you really can't hear them, but you play them back at about 100 times real speed. And you can listen, you can hear earthquakes, and you could also hear whales on these. And then I'd have to go in the middle of the night, because the computer in Woods Hole was only just powerful enough so nobody else could be on it. And I would have to play little snippets of this to digitize the data so we could analyze it. And if anybody logged down or did anything, it would crash the program and have to start again. And so I rapidly found out the best time to come in was Friday and Saturday and Sunday night. So I didn't have much of a social life, but I got a lot of work done. And I have some sounds here which I'll try and play by putting the microphone down. And the first one will be the sound of what an earthquake sound like if you play them at about 100 times real speed. I think this will work. I tried at lunchtime. So So that's a swarm of earthquakes played at about 100 times real speed. And I had about 100 of those for my study. But I also heard fin whales, and I'll play what they sound like at 100 times real speed.
Excuse me, can you hold the mic a little further away?
Yeah, I don't think that would
No,
work.
from when you talk.
Yes, okay. Unfortunately, you can't hear the fin whales. I'm not sure why. I could hear them at lunchtime. But basically, fin whales make these, they're 1 second chirps at about 20 hertz. So if they were played at real speed, that's just about the lowest threshold we can hear. And they're very repetitive. They just make sounds out in every 25 seconds, or in the Atlantic they're a little bit closer. So they're relatively simple vocalizations. Well, at the time I wanted to study these, and my advisor encouraged me, but the constraints of the program that I was in required me to do 2 projects on different geological topics, and the committee that was in charge of this didn't accept this as being allowed. So I went on with my career. And I came to the University of Washington, and there really is a sort of wonderful, sort of natural geological laboratory off our coast here. We have our own tectonic plate here. There's a mid-ocean ridge, the Wandafuka Ridge, and also the Gorda Ridge further south. There's a very large subduction zone, which at some point will produce catastrophic earthquakes. There's transform faults. There's a little hotspot volcano, axial volcano. So there really is a remarkable array of things to study. I continued studying mid-ocean ridges, and I've been involved in a variety of experiments. Most of them on something called the Endeavour segment of the Wandafuka Ridge, which has been studied by scientists at the University of Washington and elsewhere for about 3 decades. And it's about a 100-kilometer long segment. So what we're seeing here, this is again a map of the bathymetry, so it's about 100 kilometers from here to here. The reds are shallow and the blues are deep, but the shallow is about 2,200 meters. So over a mile, and the blues are about a little less than 3 kilometers. And the ridge axis is marked by the yellow line, and it's just a little kind of valley. It's about a kilometer wide and about 100 meters deep, marks the axis of spreading. And this is a very active volcano. Hasn't erupted for a while, but it has very vigorous hydrothermal fields, mining heat. There's magma about 2 kilometers beneath the surface. A lot of very interesting biology associated with these hydrothermal systems, organisms which survive on chemical energy rather than solar energy. And the seafloor is comprised of pillar basalt, so it's pretty inhospitable. And the group here has been, at the University of Washington, has been trying to understand how oceanic plates form, and also how these hydrothermal systems, and this is an example of something that's emitting fluids at very close to 400 degrees C, which is the high pressures, that's basically the boiling point of water, how all the chemicals in these, how they support life. Many people think this may have been where life either originated or at least lived early on Earth. And my colleague John Delaney, who is currently the director of something called Neptune, or the regional scale node, just got renamed, but a plan to put a cabled network off the coast. He got, about 10 years ago, got a grant for many millions of dollars from the Keck Foundation to basically do a prototype experiment where we'd go out and put a seismic network on the sea floor And we'd also instrument the vents themselves, the hydrothermal vents, and collect samples. And the idea was the belief that when you have earthquakes in the subsurface, they accelerate the flow of fluids, and that leads to blooms in the biotope because there's more energy, more chemicals coming out. And we wanted to try and develop experiments to study that. And so the aim was to develop an experiment that you could eventually transfer to a cable observatory. And so I'm now going to talk about the deployment of the seismic network just a little while, and then we'll get on to showing some data about whales. These are conventional ocean bottom seismometers and hydrophones. I've already shown you this one, but these are a couple of other different kinds. And as I said before, they're dropped from a ship, and they fall to the seafloor, and then you recover them. And part of the problem with these instruments is the seafloor can be very, very rough. And that means these instruments, especially when you're trying to put a seismometer, a hydrophone measures sound waves in the water. A seismometer is basically measuring how the ground is shaking, and you can think of it as sound waves in the earth. And the seismometers have to be very well coupled. They have to the earth, and they have to be level. And if you're trying to deploy something, if anybody's been to a sort of rough, it's like a very mountainous terrain, lots of rocks. It's very hard to get things level by just dropping them passively. So the aim of this experiment was to do something else for the seismic instrument, for the seismic part of it, was to use a combination of research vessels. We used the Thomas G. Thompson, which is operated by the University of Washington, and the Western Flyer, which is operated by Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And then 3 different remotely operated vehicles. These are vehicles that basically go to the seafloor on a long tether, fiber optic tether, and get control. They're like very expensive gaming toys. And we use Ropos, which is a Canadian one from Vancouver Island. This is Jason, this is from the Woods Hole Oceanographic, and this is a Tiburon, which is the Ambari, Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And over multiple years, we only used one at a time. We used all these instruments. And the aim was to try and deploy seismometers very, very precisely. And I'll just go through how we did that. First of all, we went down on one of these instruments and we drilled holes into the sea floor. And if you want to drill something, you want to drill a hole, you basically have to push against it. And these remotely operated vehicles are neutrally buoyant, so they don't have they go horizontally, so they're not designed to basically push very hard vertically. So you only can drill a horizontal hole. So we basically drill the horizontal hole. This is basically looking off the front of the vehicle, drilling a hole. And at great expense, we spend hours just drilling holes in the sea floor. And then we would plug the hole with a marker, and then this is an acoustic beacon. On the end of this is an acoustic beacon, so we could find it. We did this in 1 year, and we would come back the next year and deploy the seismometer. This is the sort of front view of the remotely operated vehicle. And these are amazing. They basically have arms that the pilots can control. Each pilot controls one manipulator arm, there's another one you can't see. And on the front, they call this the porch. This is the electronics for the ocean bottom seismometer. And the sensor, you probably can't see it, but we'll see it better. It's in some holster there. And this thing basically gets dropped down to the sea floor. The Ambari basically have a moon pool, which is a hole in the middle of the ship designed to deploy this. So you just deploy it through this hole, open the doors, and send it down to the bottom of the ocean. Then goes down a couple of kilometers, and then with control from the surface, then we're just inserting, this is a seismometer, which is being inserted into the hole. And this is about 15 inches long, 2.5 inches diameter, and it has seismic sensors in it, which basically measure the vibrations in 3 directions, in the vertical direction and 2 horizontal directions. And this shows the final deployment. The seismometer is completely inserted in the hole. Now it's very, very well coupled, so it's going to very faithfully record how the ground's oscillating. And then it should, in this hard hat, there's a glass sphere with electronics and batteries. I'll go quickly through the other kind of instrument we deployed. Is the broadband seismometer. The one I've just shown you records signals from about 1 hertz to 50 hertz. This was an attempt to deploy a more sophisticated instrument which actually would record the Earth oscillating at frequencies as small as 10 oscillations per hour, all the way up to 50 hertz. And we basically, when this was buried in sediment, so just away from the ridge axis where there's basalt on the floor, you can find little areas where there are ponds of sediment. So we found one of these, and we're basically burying, and this is basically a 24-inch plastic. I think it's just basically sewer pipe. We're trying to bury it in the sea floor and then vacuum out sediments from inside it, so we have a hole to put a seismometer in. It's a very big instrument. And so this is basically just a suction system. So we would suck sediments out of this, and then periodically we'd actually just sit on top of this with the remotely operated vehicle, try and push it down, and then we'd suck more sediments out. We'd end up with a hole like this, and this is now ready to take a seismometer. This is the seismometer now sitting on the front of the remotely operated vehicle. There's a long cable that goes from this seismometer, and this is going to be plugged into the electronics. And these instruments are so sensitive that if you put on the sea floor, if you put the electronics on the sea floor, and the batteries and the electronics that would record your data, if you put them right next to the seismometer, the ocean currents on the top of that would generate signals you pick up. So we have a 20-meter cable to go away from that. And then we basically place this package in the hole. And here it's inserted in the hole, and you have to be very careful it's not touching the sides, because that would mean you get very bad seismic data. And then we go back, and this is the electronics package, and this instrument needs a lot of power, so three of these are full of lithium batteries to power it for a year. And the aim was to get these instruments so we could power them from a cable where we'd have power coming along. And basically there are two plugs here, very expensive things that are designed so that you can plug in things with power and communications underwater. And so this is the one for the seismometer, and then this is a plug in the remotely operated vehicle. So we plug this in here, and then we plug it on the remotely operated vehicle, and then we have the seismometer connected to the ship, and we could adjust its timing, and we could make sure it's working. Once we were happy it was working, we then have to fill the hole, and we do that basically with glass beads. This is a bead hopper that we place over the hole, and we just basically open the valve and we pour in very fine glass beads. And you can see that's, I think, the hopper, and then here we actually have a bag of beads, we're just topping it up. And the final version of this is you sort of have, well, where is the seismometer? Well, I think I show you, yes, this is the seismometer now buried. And so this now is out of the currents in the bottom of the ocean, so you get very good data. And this was all designed, one of the things we wanted to do was to get seismic tremor as well as earthquakes. And this is the network. This is a zoom in on sort of 10 kilometers right in the middle of the ridge axis, where there's 2 kilometers beneath the surface of this, so we're 2 kilometers beneath the sea floor, but 2 kilometers deeper you have this large magma chamber basically running along the ridge. These are the high temperature vent fields. There's 5 of them known. Total of about 1,000 megawatts coming out of this, so it's like a medium-sized power station, so a lot of thermal energy, geothermal energy. And then we deployed a total of 8 seismometers to study the earthquakes associated with these. And we had a lot of data, and when I was a graduate student, we only had a week or two's worth of data. We had a year, and then we actually repeated this and collected 2 more years. So the first year, we decided we needed a lot of people to help us, so we ran a class in Friday Harbor Labs, and we had 8 enthusiastic students who each spent their time picking earthquakes, finding earthquakes, and picking the arrivals. And one thing we noted was the ones who had the data in the winter were taking a lot longer to get through it. And that's because that's when all the fin whale calls were there, so they were having trouble finding the earthquakes and then all the fin whale calls. But what these students did is they basically have to identify when the seismic waves come. So this is a seismogram, and I'll show quite a few of these. Basically on the bottom axis is just showing time, and I think here I'm showing about 4 seconds of time. And then each one of these packets of 3 lines represents 1 seismic station. And then what we're showing, and there's basically 3 sensors. There's one, the Z, which is vertical, and then X and Y are horizontal. And so they're basically plotting the vibrations of the ground in 3 different directions. And for sound that goes through the Earth, there's 2 kinds of sounds. There are things called P waves, compressional waves, which are basically analogous to the sound that goes through water. But you also have shear modes, because a solid can support shearing, so you have a different kind of wave called a shear wave, and that's what's shown in red. So these students would basically pick the arrivals when the P waves came in, and they tend to show up on the vertical channels of Z, and then the shear waves tend to have the highest amplitudes on horizontal channels. And based on having the times of all these, you can then triangulate and locate where the earthquake is. And if it was a different audience, I would now spend a lot of time showing you earthquake locations. You know, we've got a lot of earthquake locations, and we have a couple of papers that have been published, and a few more still on the way. And I think that's all I want to say on that. But we also had a huge number of fin whale calls. And this is what a fin whale call looks like on the seismometers. So again, I've got basically packets. I haven't separated them as nicely, but each one of these is a different seismic station. And you can see the fin whale sound vocalizations. And this is about 14 seconds of data. And if you could measure the spacing of these, the sort of peaks and valleys and these oscillations, they're basically 20 hertz chirps. And you can see that they arrive sooner on some stations than others. And that's, again, gives you the ability to triangulate and locate them. You'll also see that you get multiple arrivals. You basically see something coming here, and then something coming here, and maybe something there. And so you can do that. And that's something known as multipathing. And that simply happens because if you have a whale at the surface here and a seismic station here, you can have energy that travels straight through the water column, or you can have energy that bounces down off the seafloor, back up, down to the surface, and then back down and up and down. And you have something that does that once, or you can have it do it twice or 3 times. And these are known as multipaths. So on this particular record, things enabled 0, that's basically, that's a direct arrival, it goes straight there. 1 and 2 are things that have taken 1 or 2 legs up and down through the water column to get there. And that really helps us locate. There's the information of when these different arrivals come, and also their amplitudes, tells you a lot about where the whale is located. Well, the first thing we could do is we could count the number of whale calls we got. We have fairly good algorithms that could find earthquakes, basically looking for sudden energy arriving. And when we first started running these, most of them were fin whales. But earthquakes have most of their energy beneath 10 hertz, and fin whales have these chirps of 20 hertz, so we could use the frequency information to separate them. And so we did that to get the earthquakes. When we came to study the fin whales, we just had to change a greater than to a less than sign in some algorithm, and we suddenly got all the fin whales. And so this is a histogram over 3 years showing the number of fin whales calls per day recorded by this network. And it goes, you can basically see, I don't show it, they'll show all the summer months, but there are basically very few during the summer, and lots starting in the fall and in the winter. And so I think the maximum you've got is 4,000 or so. But in the winter, you see fin whales nearly every day. So armed with this information, I went to the Office of Naval Research, seeing where they were interested in studying them. And I think I went in there where they just got a doubling of their budget because of the Navy's concern about the effect on beaked whales. So most of that money has gone to a lot of work on beaked whales, but the Navy's interested in maintaining some research across all the fields, so I was lucky to get that. And we basically just noted to them that the hydrothermal vents put out a lot of nutrients into the water column. They rise in plumes that only go a few hundred meters above the sea floor. But my colleague Rick Thompson at the Institute of Ocean Sciences has shown that zooplankton feed on these nutrients, on the microbes. And you have enhanced zooplankton above the hydrothermal vent fields. And some of these zooplankton go all the way up and down to the water column. So there are probably, at least in the summer when he's gone out there, there's been enhanced zooplankton. So we said maybe there are a lot of fin whales here because they're feeding on the zooplankton. I don't think that's correct, but we haven't fully tested that hypothesis. But I'll show you a little more on what we've done. But that's what got us the money, and people were interested. And this is what I showed you. What I just showed you was what a fin whale looks like when it's inside the network. And our network's pretty small. It's about 10 kilometers long and 3 or 4 kilometers wide. This is what a fin whale looks like when it's maybe 10 kilometers outside the network. And you can see it's a lot more noisy, the seismograms. And it turns out most of this noise are other fin whales that are even further away. But what I'm just going to describe is how we sort of locate a fin whale. And what we do is we have an automatic algorithm that basically would take one instrument and we'll try and identify when there are times when you have high amplitude, and we look at all 3 traces for that instrument. I won't get into the details, but basically this is showing the blue lines is where on these seismograms we've sort of automatically picked where we think there may be a fin whale call coming in. And we can do that, run that algorithm, and then we get, and you may not see them very well, blue lines are showing where we think there may be calls coming from fin whales. And this is spurious, this is the real one. But most of these are real arrivals. And now we have to try and figure out where the fin whale is from this. Well, computers now are getting more and more powerful, so there's a brute force way known as a grid search method, where basically we take a grid that I think is about 40 by 40 kilometers, and at every point on that grid, spaced a few hundred meters apart, we try and see what the times of the arrivals from the fin whales would be compared to what we see. And we basically find the point on the grid that fits them the best. And it uses a lot of computer times, but computers are quick now. And the great thing about it is it always works. It always finds where the fin whale is. And so this is just showing the results of that, and the red is just showing the predictions. And the algorithm's clever enough just to throw away calls when they're bad. I think there's one bad one here, another bad one over there. But it does a pretty good job of fitting all the rest. And then we can plot where that is, and this is just showing that one location. And this is our seismic network, and we've now zoomed out, so we're looking at about 100 kilometers from north-south. And this one is basically to the west of the network, I think, between 10 and 15 kilometers away. And because these fin whales make very repetitive calls, they make a call every 25 seconds, when one's chirping away, we can track it. We can track where they go. And this is just showing an example of a track. And again, so we're now 20 kilometers, basically either side of the ridge axis. The ridge axis is in black. We've actually rotated our reference frame a few degrees. And then this is basically almost north-south. So again, we're looking at about 30 kilometers total. And the color scale is just showing time. So basically, we're showing the time of day. So this is a whale on the November the 9th, 2003. Started making a noise at about 9 o'clock. We always work with Greenwich Mean Time in seismology. And then as it goes along the track, we just change the color. So this track lasted a total of about 5 hours. And there's a couple of large gaps in it. But we could basically track this whale swimming north and then started heading east. Went silent across the ridge axis, and then we picked it up again, and then I think it continued to call, but it's basically outside of our range out here. Well, I have a graduate student, Dax Sewell, who's done that for 155 whale tracks in 1 year. Originally set out to look at all 3 years, but ran out of time. He came in wanting to study seismology, and I persuaded him to do this for his master's, but he's moved on now to sort of looking at earthquakes and stuff. But it's really fascinating what we're finding. This is just an example of a track, and we're finding different calling patterns. And this is a whale which we have as 25-second interpulse interval. So basically, every 25 seconds, like a metronome, it makes a chirp. And it'll continue doing this many in a row, and then occasionally there'll be a gap in the calling, and then it'll start again. And this is showing the track. This is something called a spectrogram. And so the numbers here represent time in not very useful units. I think they're basically in seconds, so this is the total length of this is 6 minutes or something. And then up here it's showing frequency. So we can look at both how loud the sound is and what its frequency is. And basically these are the fin whale chirps. And we've modified this so everything beneath the threshold just shows us a blue. But every time you see these colors here, there's basically the fin whale. So it's centered roughly at 20 hertz, a little less. And you can see it just making these sounds very regularly. We can look at the frequency of the call. In this case, it's about 19 hertz. This is just a histogram, so they're all centered at 19 hertz. And the spacing of them, you can just see within a second or so, they're all the same spacing. And this is one kind of call, and these are believed, I think it's generally believed that only the males vocalize the fin whales, and it's believed these calls are associated with mating. There's another kind of call which is similar, but these are called 25-30 seconds dual interpulse intervals. So normally the whale's making a sound every 25 seconds, but in this, every so often, it waits for 30 seconds. And again, we can see this as a track. Again, this is a whale swimming from, I guess this was going north to south. The frequencies are the same, about 19 hertz, but we can see that the interval between the calls are some at about a little less than 25 seconds and some up at close to 30 seconds. So it's a little different, and you can see whether there's a shorter spaces there. So it's a different kind of call. Again, this is a single whale. We have no clue why they make these two kinds of calls. They're basically swimming in similar patterns when they make them. This is the most common. This is about 50% of our tracks. The other one was about 20%. Another kind, we have a kind where we have a 25 and a 13-25. So again, the interpulse interval varies. It's normally 25 seconds, but sometimes it's less than 13. And we can see that here. What's interesting about this is that the calls that come at the trailing call of a 13-second gap, in this case, has a different frequency. It's not always so. They have 25 hertz. And so we think this is two whales. So there's one whale calling with a frequency of about 20 hertz and another of 25 hertz. And when my graduate student, who knew about as much as me about whales, first saw it, they said it must be a female because it's higher frequency. Kate Stafford got extremely upset with me. So. But we really don't know. We don't know what these 25s, whether they're immature males. We don't know. It's interesting. We really don't see calls in between. They're always either 20 or 25. But this is an example now of two whales that are communicating, and obviously it's not as simple as one male marking its territory. And then the final kind of track we find is we find things that we call complex tracks, and these are things where the spacing between the calls is all over the place. And in this case we have two different frequencies, but we have some examples where we have 5 different frequencies. And these tracks tend to be straight tracks, relatively straight tracks, where the whales are swimming quite quickly. They'll be swimming sort of 7-8 kilometers per hour in a straight line. And so these appear to be groups of whales that are just transiting somewhere, and they tend to go through the network pretty quickly. In this case, it's only in the network for about 3 hours, so we just see it go across the network and disappear. So we have these 4 kinds of tracks, and we can look at what directions they were. The sort of general accepted hypothesis for fin whales that they're like the other large baleen whales. They tend to head up to the north, high latitudes in the summer to feed on the krill, and they tend to migrate to low latitudes to breed and to birth in the winter, likely because there are less predators, and one of those being killer whales there. But at least locally, that's not what we see. We see in the fall, this is just a graph, and it basically plots for each month the different track types. And basically, we plot something to the top of this if the whale's heading north in the track, and to the bottom of it's heading south. And what we see is these complex tracks where there are groups of whales that appear to be heading somewhere fairly quickly. They're mostly in the fall, not exclusively, and they have a strong tendency to be going north. So in the fall, where most people would say whales would be coming south, we see them in this very small postage stamp in the ocean heading north. If we look at these other kind of calls, they tend to be in the winter months. The simple and the most common are the dual, and then these black ones are the ones that are where there are potentially 2 whales. They tend to be in the winter months, and they're meandering tracks. They're often tracks that meander, and we track some of them for up to 24 hours just going around the network, but they have a tendency to be heading south. And we really don't know whether we're seeing something that's a sort of regional pattern with where the whales are going, or whether we're just seeing something very local, within the 20 little patch of the ocean we're looking at. We can also look at the gaps when the whales stop calling, and this is a histogram of, the gaps between calls, and we see some patterns there that they tend to pause for about 90 seconds, or I guess for about 80 seconds, for about 110 seconds. So there's some patterns here, and again, we don't really understand what they're there for. We looked at the density of the whales. In other words, we made a plot where we show in each square here, we basically color it depending on how many hours a whale is within that grid cell calling. And what we hope to find were lots of whales over the hydrothermal vents, which was linked to the zooplankton. But what we found instead is there are more whales to the north of here than to the south by about a factor of 2. Our network's as good at detecting whales in any direction, so this is a real signal. We're a couple of 100 kilometers off the coast here, and so why there would be this very stark pattern of change in whale density, we really don't have any idea. And one thing we're trying to look to see is whether we see that in other years within the data. And so that's kind of where we are now. We have this wonderful data set that we're really just trying to mine. So I want to talk to you very briefly about what we're doing, and then use most of my last remaining 5 minutes to talk about opportunities that are coming up. One thing we've seen is we see there are variations between years in the number of fin whales we see at this location, with less in 2004 than, sorry, the winter of 2004 to 5 than either the year before or the year after. And it's interesting to note this is just a plot of ocean surface temperature, and we're there in the winter, and it wouldn't be comfortable to swim in this ocean in any of the winters for us, but it's about 1 degree warmer, the ocean, so in the year when there are less fin whales there. And so they may well be tracking temperature, and there's some evidence from other studies of that. One of my students has started looking at other sites where we have data, just looking at the density of fin whales. And what we're finding is there are huge numbers of fin whales everywhere we look, which is another reason why I don't think they're feeding on the hydrothermal vents. Everywhere we go, there are fin whale vocalizations. So if these are males marking their territory, they're separating themselves basically all over the Northeast Pacific Ocean. I've got a student who's looking at how loud the fin whale calls are. That's quite important. In other words, to convert the number of calls we see to an actual density, you need to know how loud they are. And there are very few measurements of that. And so she's basically, it's quite a bit of physics because we're not measuring the hydrophonic. The hydrophonic would be easier, with the ground oscillating would be a little harder. But she's working on that. And they're about 180 dB in the oceans, which is something, same intensity as a medium-sized freighter ship. So these things, when they make a noise, they're very loud. I'm working on techniques which are pretty mathematical to try and improve the tracks. And this is just an example of a meandering track, and the grey is before we've processed it, and the red and the colours are what we get afterwards. And you can see this is a whale. We're just a few kilometres just meandering around, and we can actually locate calls within a few tens of meters relative to each other. So we can get very detailed track types. A couple of really exciting experiments that I'm involved on. One's something called the Cascadia Initiative, and this is an experiment that's aimed at looking at the subduction zone. The Tohoku earthquake in Japan really woke up seismologists, and particularly up here, because at some point an earthquake like that will occur off our coast. So with stimulus money, some of that was spent on buying ocean bottom seismometers, so it wasn't all wasted. And we have a fleet of 70 ocean bottom seismometers which are being deployed all the way from basically Cape Mendocino, Northern California, all the way to Vancouver Island, several hundred kilometers off coast. They're out there now. They're going to be going out there for about 4 years' time. They're a great opportunity to study fin and blue whales, which are the only two whales that vocalize the frequencies low enough to capture them with. But they also possibly, these instruments, we may be able to put hydrophone instruments, attach them to the frames that can go to higher frequencies. And maybe not this time, but maybe in the future. And you can imagine if you could be detecting killer whales with this kind of network, we have a lot more information about where they go when they're not in Puget Sound. And then another experiment you may have heard of is putting a cabled observatory off the coast. The Canadians have already done it with something called Neptune Canada, and the University of Washington is leading an effort to put one off U.S. waters. And these are basically, National Science Foundation is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on putting these cabled observatories permanently off the coast to study a whole wide variety of things. These are just some of the examples. So they're going to be studying a lot of processes in the Earth. Mid-ocean ridge spreading sensors is my favorite field. Seismic activity as well, but they'll look at gas hydrates, subduction zones, the effect of bathymetry on currents. And then they're studying various things in the water column. They're looking at climate change, carbon in the ocean, dissolved oxygen. There are a lot of hypoxia events off the coast. They can study ecosystems, including whales, and look at coastal upwelling. So it's going to provide instrumentation for the next 30 years to study a whole variety of things. And part of the plan of this is to have permanent acoustic monitoring off the coast. And because you have a cable, you can have very high data rates and power. So you can basically have hydrophones to basically monitor at all frequencies. So again, they'll be able to study, rather than just studying a couple of species of whales, if you can do with seismometers, you can be recording the acoustics from every marine mammal species you can think of that's here with this instrumentation. And I think I've used more time than I'm allowed, so I'll end up with a very untypical weather picture when we're out at sea.